Well, we're in the book of Acts, as you that have been regular know, and today we're in chapter 12. And this is an interesting chapter because a lot of good things happen in this chapter, as they always are when you're in God's Word. You know, all followers of Jesus have to maintain a difficult balance. We live in a natural world guided by natural laws, yet we serve a God who can, and sometimes does, overrule the laws of nature. But for the most part, he lets nature take its course. Good people get sick and die. Walter Martin once said, "The death rate in all religions is 1 per person." Hardworking people go bankrupt. Innocent people are convicted and punished. In many cases, God does not supernaturally intervene to prevent misfortune, yet we must not view life strictly from a human perspective. Miracles rarely occur today, but they do. To carry out God's mission in His world to save sinners. That's the biggest miracle of all, is people getting saved. And He does all things for our good and for His glory. In an age when miracles are rare today, there are different parts of times in history when they were rampant, particularly when Jesus was here. Maintaining this natural, supernatural perspective can be a challenge. One might think that holding an eternal spiritual perspective would be easier if miracles were more common. As the passage demonstrates, today people always have trouble seeing beyond the here and now. And I'm not speaking of you, but of people in general. Even when God is more active in the world, the Christians in Jerusalem, this was the early church, despite their seeing some of the Lord's most amazing displays of miraculous power, struggle to break out of their two-dimensional perspective. By the way, there's 4 dimensions, as you all know. And Hugh Ross says there's actually 11. He's the scientist, physicist, that is a Christian, by the way. But God doesn't operate in dimensions. He's above all that. He created all that. In this example, they place limits on what God would or could do on their behalf. I have to be reminded often, as passage of Scripture, nothing is too hard for the Lord. And that's, by the way, twice in the Bible, Jeremiah 32:17 and Genesis 18:14. So let's get started. Herod Agrippa 1 moves on the scene, verses 1 and 2 of chapter 12. Now about that time, Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some of the church. Then he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. This is not James, the brother of Jesus. This is James, the disciple. Luke takes us back in time to shortly before the worldwide famine. We saw that last week. And up to this time, the chief enemies of the church had been the Sanhedrin, the political and religious leaders associated with the temple, the high priest and his gang of Sadducees primarily, plus the Pharisees. Then Peter visited Caesarea. That's when Herod Agrippa began to involve himself for political reasons. That's why most rulers involve themselves a lot, especially in the church. Abraham Lincoln once said that no one can get elected unless they're a Christian. And that's pretty much held now. Some of them call themselves Christian. I don't know if they are or not. But that's pretty much been true in the history of the U.S. anyway. By this time, the name Herod had become a title, much as the designation Caesar. And by the way, there were 6 Herods and 12 Caesars. This particular Herod was Agrippa I. He had acquired land and titles by choosing the right political partnerships at the right time, undercutting anyone who got in his way. It sounds kind of typical of politicians, doesn't it? Including his own family. In fact, Herod the Great killed members of his own family he didn't like. He had gained control of all the land once ruled by his 2 uncles, Philip and Herod Antipagus. And he had designs on eclipsing the power of the grandfather Herod the Great. That was his grandfather. You know, Tony and I visited the tomb of Herod the Great when we went to Jerusalem. It was kind of interesting because when he built it, they made a man-made hill which you had to climb up to quite a ways to get to his tomb. And Herod had built all of these gardens and grand things and made a big park around it. It looked like just desert when we walked up, desert. You walked up to the top of that hill and you looked, and there was this huge monument, and right in the center of it was Herod's tomb. You could hardly see the tomb, everything else just engulfed it. But I knew that at the time it was like a beautiful place, and this was just desert with this thing standing out there. But it was still interesting. It was about 7.5 miles south of Jerusalem, by the way. To gain Judea, and by the way, Judea, I've reminded you before, is the west, what they call the West Bank now. King Agrippa needed to convince the powers of Rome that their interests were better served with him in control of one of the procurators. Sorry about that. Like Pilate was in Judea. Number one, my first partner in business was a Palestinian, and his father was the mayor of Jerusalem before the 1967 war. He was very rich, and so he sent his son here to America to be educated at USC, and we kind of carpooled together to work and decided we want to leave Vaughn's and have a business together. The only problem was our cultures were so different that he alienated some of our business partners, and we decided we had to get a divorce. And that turned out good for both of us, by the way. Number two, Tony and I on a trip. I already said that. After James was killed, Peter is next. Verses 3 through 5. And because he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to seize Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. So when he had arrested him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 squads of soldiers to keep him, intending to bring him before the people after the Passover. Peter was therefore kept in prison, but constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church. This is a real key verse. Constant prayer was made for him by the church. And when Herod was about to bring him out, that night Peter was sleeping bound. Well, let me stop here and make a couple of comments on this before I go on. The designation, the Jews, much of Luke's writings, is a technical term for religious and political leaders in Israel. In the first part of Acts, he doesn't mean the Jews in the racial sense. At the time, the vast majority of the church was comprised of ethnic Jews. By the way, it was 100% Jews initially. Well, we're now down the road probably 35 or 40 years from that. Increasingly, however, the Jewish rulers were able to turn more and more of the Jewish people against the followers of Messiah. A gradual parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, synagogue and church, as distinct religious groups was taking place. Now, as I was thinking of this, I was thinking about Satan and Putin. You say, what is wrong with that? Well, Putin claims his country is a religious country of Christianity, of Christians. Now, he doesn't like it. There are some Orthodox Christians, no doubt there. But Putin's mindset is, I'm going to keep this going because I can outweigh him. You think Satan thinks like that? I'm going to keep this going because they're going to get tired and I can outweigh them. Kind of same motives. Because Agrippa ruled Judea directly as a representative of Rome, he had power to sentence people to death without needing anyone's permission. You know, a lot of dictators in a lot of countries do that. They just kill people at will. And certainly that's true today. To galvanize the Jews' hostility against the Christians by publicly accusing Peter of violating Jewish traditions. Agrippa placed Peter in prison because the feast of Passover and unleavened bread, celebrated back-to-back for 8 days, prevented trials, Deuteronomy 16:1 and 2. The Greek term for squad that it uses here means four. It's double the number of soldiers used for prisoners. They knew that Peter had escaped from prison before, so they wanted to just make sure he doesn't again. Luke calls attention to the opposite forces involved. On the one side, Agrippa locks Peter behind bars. On the other side, the church prays fervently for the apostles' behalf. You know, I was thinking about this, the two prayers, and in Lincoln's second inaugural address, I'm sure many of you have been to the monument and read that. What has always stuck in my mind is the Lord was praying, the North was praying for God's intervention, and the South was praying for God's intervention. Who's he going to hear? Well, he's going to hear his own will. It's what needs to be done. Peter proves to be a sound sleeper. Verses 6 through 10. And when Herod was about to bring him out, that night Peter was sleeping, bound with 2 chains between 2 soldiers, and the guards before the door were keeping prison. Now behold, an angel of the Lord stood by him, and a light shone in the prison and struck Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, Arise quickly. And his chains fell off his hands. Then the angel said to him, Gird yourself and tie up your sandals. And so he did. And he said to him, Put on your garment and follow me. So he went out, followed him, and did not know that what was done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. Now when they were past the first and the second guard post, they came to the iron gate that leads to the city, which just automatically opened to them on its own accord. And he went out and went down one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. So he was left alone on the street. Even when storms are raging on the outside, if you're at peace with God on the inside, all is well. On the last night of the Passover, God intervened. The situation with one soldier chained to Peter's right arm and the other chained to his left, and 2 posted at the entrance to the cell, the circumstances looked bleak for Peter. It's doubtful the guards slept during the 6 hours they remained on duty. Peter, on the other hand, slept like a healthy baby. I heard one time a brand new CEO of Coca-Cola, which is a brand that's been around forever, had just taken over and things went sour. And somebody asked him, well, how do you sleep at night? He says, I sleep like a baby. I wake up every 2 hours and cry. Peter had been in a similar situation before in Acts chapters 4 and 5. God strikes again supernaturally. An angel appeared and filled Peter's cell with light. This was more than a dream-like vision within his mind, and yet Peter's guards, all of whom undoubtedly remained awake during their 6-hour shift, saw and heard nothing. To Peter, the experience seemed totally unreal. To the guards, everything seemed normal. While Peter saw things as they were, the guards were deluded. After Peter was delivered, he goes to Mary's house in verses 11 and 12. It says, and when Peter had come to himself, he said, now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel and has delivered me from the hand of Herod and from all the expectations of the Jewish people. If so, when he had considered this, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. By the way, this Mark is the one that wrote the Gospel of Mark, and it's sometimes called the Gospel of Peter because everyone believes he got that Gospel from Peter. See, Mark didn't walk with Jesus all that time. He had to get his Gospel from somebody else. So that was probably Peter. Peter is now in control of his consciousness. After he thought he was seeing a vision, by the way, if you're awake when you're having a vision, if you're a dream, you're asleep. Sometimes you don't know which is which. If you're kind of drowsy or whatever, a little bit out of your mind. Maybe because earlier in chapter 5, an angel had delivered Peter and John from prison. No guards were mentioned. Then, suggesting the apostles simply walked out through the gates and he deserted jail. And the public street confirmed what had seemed so surreal. So Peter took off to find the believers who were praying at the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was called Mark. She was probably a widow of some considerable means. She had a very large house. When the congregations first started, and they were all house churches at that time, she could hold a pretty good congregation at her church. So she was probably pretty rich. Peter had trouble getting through the gate. Verses 13 to 15. This is kind of a funny story. And then Peter knocked. At the door of the gate, a girl named Rhoda came to answer. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her gladness, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter stood before the gate. But they said to her, you are beside yourself. Yet she kept insisting that it was so they said, it is his angel. Typical homes, especially large homes, were encircled by a wall, and the outer gate was large and some distance from the house, so a knock at 3 o'clock in the morning rarely brought good news. If you got a telephone call at 3 in the morning, you think it's going to be good news? Unless a baby is born. And they're not going to call everybody till the next day, only a couple. Rhoda recognized Peter's voice, but in the excitement to share the good news, she failed to let him in. The group scolded Rhoda, you're out of your mind. Now, expositors suggest 3 possible meanings here. Number 1, it is his ghost. Some Jewish rabbis held that a person's spirit lurks around for a couple of days after death. Now, by the way, I've read a lot of books, out-of-body experience. People claim they visited heaven and came back, which I don't buy into, but one of their experiences usually is they're kind of out of the body, looking all things around before they're taken up into heaven. Number two, they said it is his guardian angel, based on Psalms 91:11 and Daniel 10:21. I guess you can kind of get that. I didn't. Teaches that a guardian angel assumes the appearance of the person he protects and can act on his or her behalf. That's kind of interesting. Number three, the expositors also, it is his human messenger. By the way, most of the people that wrote books of the Bible, and others, rabbis as well, had a person that was his assistant that recorded notes along the way. You know, how do you remember something 37 years later or all that unless they write things down? So this was the answer here. It was his human messenger. The term angelos, or angel, literally means messenger. The group may have thought that Rhoda had heard Peter's assistant coming to them with a message conveying his dying wishes or last-minute instructions for them. My vote is number 3, by the way, if any of these are true. Regardless of, two things are clear. First, they couldn't believe that Peter was standing at the door safe and sound. That's understandable. Number 2, no one behaved rationally. When things are going on, you're fearful. You don't think rationally. That's why you need to focus and pray to God. Such things occur when people are fearful. Bible has 365 fear nots and don't be afraid. One for every day. Some people have kind of marked those out in their Bible, and Monday's this one and Tuesday and that one. It is no secret what God can do. Verses 16 and 17. Now Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. Even though they had been praying for his release, they didn't believe it was him. But motioning them with his hand to keep silent, he declared to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison, and said, "Go tell these things to James and to the brethren." And he departed and went to another place. Peter had casually walked past the king's guards to escape execution, but he couldn't get a little servant girl to open the gate, to let him in to join the prayer meeting on his behalf. Finally, when gaining interest, he related to the story, giving all the credit to the Lord. You know, have you ever prayed for something and a day or two later you think, I didn't thank God for that? Oh, you hit yourself and you do it. You hopefully do it right then, but many times, well, I'm not going to say we're guilty of that, but a lot of people say, I prayed so hard for God to do this, and they never thank Him for it, and they never even think about the fact that God did this, and they start getting caught up in themselves, thinking they did it. Always do that. Then he instructed them to tell James, the Lord's brother, and the brother. I'm going to close with a little bit of a checklist here. This section of Acts is all about constant prayer that was offered by the church, that was heard and answered by God in a miraculous way. I'm sure the church prayed hard for Stephen not to be stoned, but he was killed and went to heaven. Why? Well, Stephen was meant to be the first martyr of the church, and there's great reward in being a martyr, and he was the first. Peter had much work yet to be done. Only God knows the final outcome. But the lesson here, I believe, is twofold. Be bold in our prayers. Don't be wishy-washy or whatever. It's going to be God's will. You can count on that. But be bold. Ask Him what you want. And be consistent or constant in our prayers. Never give up until the answer comes. Good or bad, it's going to be God's will. I know this is like preaching to the choir because this class is a class of prayer first. And secondly, it is a teaching class. We have Elaine, and there are 50 people that most of them are not here in this class because they are not able to come. But they held up their hand and said, I want to be part of that prayer. Every time I think of that, I think of Spurgeon, who had 100 people in his basement praying for him every time he preached. And I've said this before. He also said, I'd rather teach 10 people to pray than 100 people to preach. Because if every sermon is not undergirded by prayer, it's not going to work. Again, our mighty 50, led by Elaine, how do you forget your name, is doing a great job. Keep it up. Well, we're going to sing a song that I mentioned here, and I think I know this song. It is no secret what God can do. Everybody knows this song? It is no secret what God can do.